So we got that specifically for drumming because it does a good job picking up sounds, direction.
Looks like a song.
All right, so here's what's going to happen. The first part of the morning, I want you to stay as awake as possible. I'm putting this in the first part of the morning because you're awake and I'm hoping to keep you awake. Because for the first hour, things are going to be a little boring. But I have to get through this stuff. And you have to kind of get and understand it. Once we get past that, we get into a lot more hands-on kind of work, and it gets a lot more interesting. We'll have videos to watch and all of that. So hang in there for the next hour or so. I just want to review what we started with last time, which is forever and eternity, you want to remember that any time you have a person who's learning, they require the following. They require cognitive competence, they require emotional control, they require pro-social behavior, they require motivation, initiative, and stamina. Those 6 things are necessary for learning. So anything that interferes with any one of them, A, affects the other ones, and B, interferes with learning. So when you hear somebody has an educational disability, you have to ask yourself, what are the parts of these 6 things that are being affected? So just as a test, let's say I'm a diabetic, and I'm in a classroom, and it's 11 o'clock. Now what? What's going wrong where?
Blood sugar. Blood sugar is rising.
Okay, blood sugar is going down. And what happens to my body? Yeah, you become hypoglycemic, right? And then, do you have the energy necessary to act on motivation? I mean, you may be really motivated. You may love history. And you're sitting there, you really want to learn it. But your sugar level's down. Biologically speaking, you just don't have the initiative. Right? You can't maintain. And do you have stamina? No. What happens to your cognition? It's foggy, right? And then as that happens, what happens to your emotions? Does anybody know what happens to diabetics who are about to go into a diabetic
They
coma?
get really cranky.
Very cranky, right? Hypoglycemia brings crankiness. And actually, any of you who have been hungry at a class, you can recognize that. You know, it gets irritable. And then when you're cranky, what happens to your pro-social behaviors? Are you sitting up paying attention, or are you slouching on the desk and ready to fall asleep? When the teacher says something that doesn't quite get understood, you mumble under your breath, shut up already. Right? So everything, just with one little change in one of these areas, everything else gets affected to some degree or another. Is this sunshine bothering you?
It's a little bright here.
I'll close the door. I don't know if that'll help you at all. You may want to.
I can hear better. But I was at a good spot this week at work for people who are stuck outside.
Well, the heck with them. They're late. And that's, do not edit this out. People who are late. So.
Maybe I can be like get it out from my notes? Is that what you're talking about? What's going on?
It's okay. I have better attention than you guys. It's okay. So I just want you to sort of remember this as we go to this part of.
There's some stuck outside.
Oh,
And that seems just fine.
Everybody yell out.
Yeah.
There's so many people here.
What did you expect? A private party?
Sorry we're late.
That's all right. So, what has to happen in the special education process is that first, people have to actually be recognized for having difficulty. Remember what we said last time? What's that called? Child notes people. What's the official way in which people have to recognize a person that might have a disability and start the referral? Child find, exactly. Exactly. So, as a school district administrator, twice a year, or at least once a year by law, once a year you have to put an ad in the paper that says anyone, and not just in the paper, you have to inform pediatricians, you have to inform kindergartens and preschool, private kindergartens and preschool. Good morning.
Oh, shit.
All right. You know what we're going to do?
You can go in?
Yeah, that way you'll have good. All right, so twice a year, at least once, we send out a notice in the newspaper, and we send it to all the pediatricians, private daycare places, preschool, kindergarten, that says if you suspect a child 3 years or older as having, and 3 years up to 21, has an educational disability, please let us know. Please identify that person, right? We also give that notice to all parents. If you believe your child has an educational disability, you need to come forward and tell us. So, child find is this business of recognition, right? Now, this is this particular slideshow puts pre-referral and referral in two separate categories. The law doesn't distinguish them as two separate categories, actually. What the law says is, look, you got to do something about a problem before you go into a formal special education process. But in fact, a pre-referral, all that means is when you have a concern about somebody, let's say you have a child, you think the speech is delayed, you sit down with a school district administrator, principal, or somebody, and say, I think I got a problem, here's my situation, my child is delayed in speech, right? Now, what's the purpose of pre-referral, do you think? Because once you refer somebody, you have to go through a multidisciplinary evaluation we'll talk about. Well, what's the purpose of having a pre-referral process?
Maybe like a screening process?
Why? Why would you want to screen something out?
If there's a particular specialist, possibly, that they need to see, you know, generally speaking, you know, especially with dealing with people who have certain disabilities, it can go into like different categories. Like you wouldn't go see, you know, a doctor that was specifically doing neurological things if you had something like physically.
Okay, so part of the pre-referral process, you may want to start looking at where do we even go? Maybe there's somebody to actually address the issue right off the bat before we get to the special education referral process. That's one, that's true. But there is one other thing, and here's what I want to put. Why is this acting as a... Wow, that's weird. Let me try that again. Wait, what's this one? So, pre-referral distinguishes between issues and disabilities. I'll give you an example. When I was director of special ed in Manchester, we received a call about a child who was having a really hard time in sitting still and paying attention, wasn't doing his homework, blah, blah, blah. So, on the surface, it looks like the kid is having an educational difficulty, right? And he was. He wasn't learning, he wasn't doing his homework, and his behavior was off the walls. But in talking with the parents, in that pre-referral sort of a conversation, you start understanding that this child's house just burned down, the apartment burned down. They're living in a shelter, and it's only been going on for a month. So you say to yourself, is this kid responding to a circumstance that is difficult and therefore interfering with his learning? Sure. Should we go do an IQ test? No. These are difficult circumstances. We have to help support the family, help them, help support the child. but we don't need to go through the entire process of evaluating, placement, identification, blah, 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 right? So that's one situation. Another situation is child's really depressed, has been for the past 3 or 4 months, can't learn, can't do anything. You find out the kid's dad has died. Well, that's a typical reaction. That's not a disability. It is definitely a condition, it's definitely an issue, and it definitely interferes with this person's ability to learn and participate in learning. But it is not a disability condition. You don't go through an entire referral process just for that. So what you want to do in the pre-referral process is isolate those situations that give you cause to think this is an internal problem. This is the problem that the child is bringing internally, characteristically, to the process. And it's got to be for an extended period of time and to a severe degree. So you can't take something that's been happening for only 3 months as evidence that the child is having difficulty in the learning disabilities area. You have 3-year-olds who have a slight speech impediment, right? And you send one of these child find notices out, and mom says, "Oh Lord, yes, he can't pronounce his S's right." Okay. So you see the child, and you ask people, "Do you understand this?" "Yeah, we pretty much understand this." "Is there a problem with this mispronounced S?" "Not really. He's happy. Everybody else is happy. He's doing his work. He's got no social issues, no academic issues. Yes, he has an issue with the S, but it doesn't affect him. So there's really no reason to go through the entire referral process. So there are some things that you can screen out in the pre-referral process, right? But once you get past this, you now have to develop a referral, which is you send this essentially as a legitimate concern to a team who will be doing an evaluation. And this team has to be multidisciplinary. What do I mean by that? That means if you have a concern about learning disabilities, you got to have a psychologist, school psychologist there, you got to have a learning specialist there, and you also have to have a teacher and a parent there in the evaluation process. You can't just say, he's got a learning disability, we'll get an opinion from a school psychologist and be that. That doesn't work. That's how it used to be in the old days. But we found, do you remember when we were talking about loss of Laconia? How many people were sent there just on the say-so of one doctor, right? So Public Law 84182 decided that they really wanted to prevent one person having that much power. And so they developed the idea of having a multidisciplinary team that determines what the issue is for the child.
What did you say is on that team? Parent, teacher,
Parent, teacher, a learning specialist, depending on what the area of disabilities you suspect. We'll talk about that in a minute. Usually a psychologist, speech and language evaluator, or some specialist, professional specialist in that, and the parent. Parents have to be involved in the evaluation process. There is no team without a parent.
What happens if the parent is in some kind of like denial? It doesn't.
Okay.
The child doesn't get like.
Excellent question. There are lots of parents who just don't believe their child has any difficulty, and the teachers are saying, we've got an issue. Right? If a district has a suspicion that a child has a disability and the parents refuse to acknowledge it, it is the district's responsibility. It's not even a right, it's a responsibility to go to the Department of Education and see what's called a due process hearing, where a hearing officer will determine whether an evaluation is necessary or not. At that point, when a hearing officer determines it's necessary, parental permission is no longer necessary or needed. What happens when you seek a parent's involvement and the parent doesn't show up over and over again, or the parent is in jail? What do you do then? There's a part of the law, we'll talk about that a little bit later, with that in line in the course. It's called the surrogate parent provision, where actually there's an organization in New Hampshire that trains surrogate parents You apply to the state saying these are the conditions, these are the circumstances of the parent, they're inaccessible, or we haven't been able to find